Good morning. I started the session, so if you've come on, good morning from Michael. Good morning from Comox. Awesome. Welcome. Welcome to Wainwright, Alberta, I guess I'll say from my computer. And Ben from Petawawa. Awesome. So if anyone else has come on, just say hello, good morning, so we know that you're there. Also, it is the long weekend coming up. So if you have some plans, I know it's going to be nice in Alberta. So tell us what your plans are for the long weekend. I know it doesn't seem like a long weekend for some of us. Awesome. Shauna from Ottawa, Peter, good morning. Vanessa, good morning. Julia, hello from Halifax. So people are from all over, one coast to the other. That's really awesome. And I'm kind of in the middle of the country. So does anyone have any exciting plans for the long weekend? The weather is supposed to be quite nice in Alberta, which is good. Sometimes we get snow. So a large landscaping project this weekend. Oh, that's awesome. Hopefully you have some nice weather in Comox. Andrew says hello. Good morning. Someone from Fredericton as well. Awesome. I'll just wait another minute or so before I get started. Anyone else want to share their plans for the long weekend? I do plan to do some yard work as well, which is a kind of a good thing to do when the weather is nice, and probably get out a little bit. Things are starting to open up in Alberta, some restaurants and things as well. So, and some stores, so may go out and do a little bit of that while still social distancing. Okay, I will get started. So welcome to this webinar on cannabis and health, a blunt conversation. As I mentioned, I'm Tracy. I'm the manager of health promotion in Wainwright, Alberta. So before we get started, just a few things we need to go over. So the presentation you are about to view is the intellectual property of the Department of National Defense. Any reproduction or retransmission of the slides contained in this presentation is strictly prohibited. Some of the topics discussed in this webinar may be of a sensitive nature and not appropriate for children. We ask for parental discretion. So we are going to talk about different ways of using cannabis and the health risks and stuff. So of course it's not appropriate for children. Please understand that people's stories are theirs alone to tell, and anything that is shared by the participants in this webinar, either on camera or in the chat, is not to be discussed outside of the webinar. So kind of the Vegas rules, what happens here, what we talk about stays here. The webinar is being recorded, but it will not record what's in your chat. And it will be available for viewing later on cafconnection.ca. Though active participation is encouraged, you may simply follow along without using the chat or the video microphone function if you prefer. So most of you have typed into the chat already, which is awesome. I'm going to ask you some questions. I'm going to have you do some polls as well. And if you do want me to turn on your microphone, I can do that. If you have some questions at the end, you can ask questions along the way as well, and I'll try to answer them and catch them. If I do forget them, I will go back later and go through the chat and try to answer those for you. So I'm going to start with a poll. So we're trying to get some data about the participants. So I'm going to give you, oh, sorry about that. So I'm going to ask you about your affiliation with the CAF community. So if you can answer that, we're just collecting some data on who's attending. So we know who's attending and who's not. Oh, we've got a variety of family members, lots of military members, so that's awesome. That's good. Okay, so these are the things we're going to go over this morning. We're going to look at cannabis legalization. I know it's morning for me and afternoon for some of you. What is cannabis? How is it used? The prevalence of cannabis use. Cannabis in the CAF. I'm just going to look briefly at the DAOD. Of course, if you're a serving member, you are required to know more about that policy. Health effects of cannabis. We'll look at COVID-19 and cannabis as well. And we'll look at harm reduction and lowering your risks. Good morning, Roxanne from Montreal. Awesome. So we'll look at cannabis legalization first. So I don't have a prize, but I'll get you to type in the chat, when did cannabis become legal in Canada? So I don't have a prize for the first person who can answer that question, but we'll see who comes up with the answer. Medical use in 2001. Andrew says October 17th, 2018, which is the right answer, totally, September 2019. So it was October 17th, 2018. Okay, so the Government of Canada's goal for legalizing, strictly regulating, and restricting access to cannabis is to keep cannabis out of the hands of Canadian youth and to prevent organized crime from continuing to profit from the illegal cannabis market. The new legal framework aims to take a public health approach to cannabis legalization and regulations. Research will determine the effectiveness of the legalization in reducing access and protecting public health and safety. So I have another poll for you to do. So how many grams of legal cannabis can an individual possess in public? So you can answer that poll. 30, 10, 30, 10, 30. Okay, awesome. I'm glad. A few more people are still answering 10, 30. Well, it's kind of a debate between 10 and 30, pretty close in answering those. Awesome. So it actually is 30 grams of legal cannabis, so people can possess that in public. You can also share up to 30 grams of legal cannabis with other adults. You can share it, you can't sell it to them. And you can also buy dried or fresh cannabis and cannabis oil from provincially licensed retailers. So this was a legislation when it first came out in October of 2018. People were also allowed to grow from licensed seeds or seedlings up to 4 cannabis plants per residence for personal use. So that means you could have 4 in your house. It doesn't mean each adult in your house could have 4 cannabis plants. Also, you can make cannabis products such as food and drinks at home as long as organic solvents are not used to create concentrated products. So some of these solvents might be butane or propane were used to create those cannabis products to use in cooking, and that wasn't allowed. So they amended the legislation in October of last year. So they added 3 new cannabis products. So before you could make your own edibles, but now you could buy edibles such as baked goods and beverages, and also things like gummies and chocolates. They introduced cannabis extracts such as vaping liquids, tinctures, wax, hash, and hash oil. And also cannabis topicals such as creams, lotions, balms, and similar products that are meant to be applied to a person's skin, hair, or nails. So tinctures, if you're wondering what that is, it's a liquid concentration. They use alcohol as a solvent for it, and you would buy it in a little bottle with an eyedropper. So some people will use it to put in something they're making, and also some people might use it because it's faster acting than edibles, because they'll hold it under their tongue for a bit before they ingest it. So Michael asked a question. I have knee injuries that cause pain at night and have several people suggested cannabis oil for the pain, but my doctor and I are not sold on it. When my wife went on it, I found it sketchy that an RN from the middle of Ontario checked her medical files and suggested she's a good candidate for her. Is it really good to use, or is it addictive? I'll talk about those things a little bit later on, Michael, and hopefully I've answered your question later on, because there always, of course, is the chance of addiction. Okay, so I will come back to your question, Michael, or hopefully I answer it in my presentation. As well, with the amendments to maximize the risk of overconsumption, Health Canada is setting strict THC limits for all new cannabis products. So for edibles, there's a limit of 10 milligrams of THC per package. So that means one package could contain one item with 10 milligrams, or 2 items with 10 milligrams, or 10 items with each 1 milligram of THC. So THC is delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, and we'll talk more about THC and CBD as well later on. Also, cannabis extracts, there's a limit of 100 milligrams of THC per unit that is intended to be ingested, so it could be things like capsules. In addition, there's a new limit of 1,000 milligrams of THC in a single package. So you could buy 100 capsules, each containing 10 milligrams of THC, or 200 capsules, each containing 5 milligrams of THC. And for cannabis topicals, there's a limit of 1,000 milligrams of THC per package of cannabis topical. So I'm just going to touch on this briefly. Again, some of you are serving members. So the use of cannabis by CAF members. So it's DAOD 9004-1. So it outlines the restrictions of cannabis consumption and also periods of prohibition. Talks about things like deployments, operating machinery, things like that. And it also defines the role of Canadian Forces Health Services. So the Surgeon General has some responsibilities. They need to establish policies and setting standards for the treatment of cannabis use disorder. So just like before, there was some standards around alcohol use disorder, what they would do if a member was diagnosed with that, what they would do. So they had to develop guidelines for cannabis use disorder. And they also provide education under health promotion. So that's where this webinar has come from today. So what about the medical use of cannabis in the CAF? So I'm hoping some of this will answer Michael's questions, but we'll also talk about topicals later on. So although the use of cannabis for medical purposes is legal in Canada, it is not endorsed by the CAF Health Services and not included as a benefit in the CAF spectrum of care for the treatment of any medical condition in CAF members. So in the event that a CAF member has been prescribed cannabis for medical purposes by a non-CAF physician, he or she must report to their medical officer immediately upon returning to their unit or their base. Once notified, the CAF medical authorities will ensure the appropriate medical employment limitations, are assigned to the member as appropriate. They'll take into consideration both the underlying medical condition and the side effects of cannabis. So what is cannabis? So cannabis refers to the plant species Cannabis sativa. The cannabis plant was originally grown in Asia, but of course is grown all around the world, including Canada. The most common types of cannabis that consumers may indicate they are assessing are sativa and indica. So those were the two main plants. Now, most plants today are a hybrid of these two types, and each type is marketed for different physiological effects. So if you do buy cannabis for smoking or putting into items or whatever, it'll often say on if it's sativa or indica or a hybrid. Different physiological differences. So sativa says it's more of the high or the effects are more in your head or in your brain, whereas the indica is promoted as more of a whole body effect. So just a little bit more about cannabis. So it's the tobacco-like substances consisting of the dried flowers, fruiting tops, and leaves of plants from the cannabis family. It contains hundreds of chemical substances. There's about 100 cannabinoids. These cannabinoids affect the neurotransmitter receptors in the brain and body. The two most commonly known cannabinoids are delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinoid, THC, and cannabinol, CBD. I won't be saying those again. They'll be THC and CBD. And it affects our neurotransmitter receptors in the brain and in the body. So these cannabinoids are stored and made in the plant's trichomes. The trichomes are tiny, clear hair that sticks out from the flowers and leaves of the plant. So you also have terpenes. So these terpenes are chemicals made and stored in the trichome of the cannabis plant with the cannabinoids. And these terpenes give cannabis its distinct smell. So it gives it that kind of, I always call it a skunky smell. I know sometimes I'm out somewhere and I'm like, is that a skunk or is that cannabis? I have to think about it. So that distinct smell. So why do we use the term cannabis and not marijuana? Because you hear medical marijuana. So the cannabis plant is comprised of the stem, the leaves, and the buds. And it can also be referred to cannabis as lots of different terms: marijuana, weed, pot. And those are usually just referring to the bud and the products created from the bud. The term cannabis is more accurate because it refers to the whole plant. So what cannabis does, so we'll look at the different two main cannabinoids, the THC and the CBD. So the THC is the most researched cannabinoid. The THC is responsible for the way the brain and the body responds to cannabis, including that high or that intoxication. THC has some therapeutic effects, but it also has some harmful effects. The harmful effects are much greater when the strength of the THC is higher. The potency of THC in cannabis is often shown as a percent of THC by weight. The THC potency in dry cannabis has increased from an average of 3% in the 1980s, so back when I was a teenager, to around about 15% today, and some strains can have an average of high of 30% THC. Cannabis that consists of very low amounts of THC in its flowers and leaves, so it's got to have less than 0.3%, is classified as hemp. The other cannabinoid we'll talk about is CBD. Unlike THC, CBD does not produce a higher intoxication. There is some evidence that CBD may block or lower some of the effects of the THC on the mind. This may occur when the amount of CBD in the cannabis is the same or higher than the amount of THC. CBD is also being studied for possible therapeutic effects. So I'll say several times, things need to be studied more. They need to do more research. So those are things that will be happening in the future. And as it says on the slide there, just remember CBD still falls under the same rules as other cannabis products under the Cannabis Act. I know there was a military member last year who was moving away, posted, and they were driving through the States and they had CBD oil for their dog. And I'm like, you better make sure you don't try to take that across the border, right? It still applies even though it doesn't have that higher intoxicating effect. So most cannabis products come from or can be made using the flowers and leaves of the cannabis plant. Depending on how they're made, these products can have a range of potencies of THC. This table lists the main forms of cannabis and the typical potencies of THC. So the potency of THC in cannabis is often shown as a percent of THC by weight. Some cannabis extracts can have up to 90% THC, as it's showing there. Fresh and dried leaves can have up to 30%. And of course, it varies in edibles and tinctures and sprays and creams and salves because it depends how much is added to it. So how is cannabis used? So if you can type in the chat, I see Michael and Amy are having a little conversation. I'll go back and look at it later. So if you can type in the chat, what are some of the ways cannabis is used? So how would people use it? Smoking. What else? What other ways do people use it? Use it for pain relief. They can eat it for sure, smoke it, eat it, rubs, they can vape it. Awesome, good. I think you guys covered all of them. A spray. Okay, good. Okay, so smoking is the most common way that it's used. So joints, pipes, blunts, water, pipes, and bongs. So again, the time or the effect, it takes seconds to minutes to feel the effects, and it usually lasts 6 to 24 hours. Of course, there are some health risks. Smoke of any kind irritates the lungs, and also there's a chance of exposing other people to that secondhand smoke. As well, some people have asked, is it better if you do use a water pipe or a bong, because it filters the smoke a little bit, but it does filter out some of the stuff, but there definitely are still some dangers to using a water pipe or a bong. It doesn't filter out all the harmful effects and the harmful chemicals. So vaping and vaporizing is kind of all put together here as inhaling it, but e-cigarettes and vape pens would use a cannabis extract, whereas vaporizers would use the dry leaf that's heated and then that vapor is inhaled, so it is different. The effects are the same as smoking it. Right now, the safety is unknown, especially with e-cigarettes and vape pens, and we'll talk about that later on. They can have high levels of THC and other chemicals that may be dangerous. They don't always know the effects of that right now because it is a relatively, especially e-cigarettes are a relatively newer thing. Eating or drinking. So edible cannabis, baked goods, beverages, cannabis extracts, such as capsules or other ingested extracts. Now, the time is different here. So 30 minutes up to 3 to 4 hours to feel the full effects. And the effects last from 8 to 24 hours. So the difference of smoking it or vaping it is it takes longer to feel the effects, and the effects can last longer. So the body slowly digests edibles, so it takes longer to feel the effects. People need to be aware of that so they don't consume additional edibles. So you should need to use caution when you're doing that. So when you eat cannabis, the THC needs to be metabolized in your liver, and it actually changes the THC to 11-hydroxy-THC. So the higher the intoxication is different than if you smoke it or vape it. So even someone who might be an experienced smoker of cannabis will feel different effects when they eat it. So the effects are different. Cannabis extracts. So this is oils, dab, wax, or shatter. Again, the effects are a lot quicker, just similar to smoking or vaping it, but they have high potency, so they contain 60 to 80% THC, so there are some dangers of that as well, greater health risks. And lastly, topicals, and I know Michael was asking a little bit about these. So cannabis topicals are intended to be used only on hair, skin, and nails. The current scientific evidence regarding the health effects of cannabis topicals, including the effects such as impairment, is extremely limited. As such, it is unknown whether the use of cannabis topicals could result in impairment. However, if the product contains THC and is applied in sufficient amounts, the use of the topical product could result in some psychoactive effects and impairment. Additional research is needed to better understand the effects associated with the cannabis topical. So they don't really know. They do think if there's enough THC in it and you put enough on, it could give some impairment. This morning when I woke up on the radio, there was an ad for a cannabis cream for rashes and stuff on your skin that's made from the root of the cannabis plant. I thought it was kind of interesting to hear that this morning. So they're definitely out there, those topicals. So what about synthetic cannabis? So you should avoid synthetic cannabis because they are illegal, and also there's some health effects too. So some examples are K2 and spice. They are not cannabis. These products are very different, and they have much stronger effects and are more dangerous. They're actually dried plant matter that's sprayed or coated with a man-made hallucinatory substance, and it's made in an attempt to mimic THC. The contents of most synthetics are unknown, they're untested, and can change from product to product. They can range from being very weak to being very strong because, of course, they are illegal, so there's no regulation. Using synthetic cannabis can lead to severe health problems such as seizures, irregular heartbeat, hallucinations, and even in some rare cases, death. So, of course, avoid using those. So what are some signs of cannabis use? How would you know someone had used cannabis? What might be some of the signs you'd see? I'll get you to type that into the chat. What are some of the things you might see? Happiness. Okay, so someone's in a good mood, hungry, red eyes, change in speech, reactions more so. They might be laughing, those glossy eyes. Okay, awesome, good. So I think you guys mentioned most of these. So you might have the odor of cannabis as well. Glassy and red eyes, unusual talkativeness, so being really happy. Dilated pupils, good one. Slow reaction, inattention, lethargy, unsteady gait, poor coordination, anxiety. So there's a variety of signs that you might be able to notice if someone is under the influence of cannabis. So we'll look at the prevalence of cannabis use. So I'm going to give you another poll. So what percent of the world's population do you think uses cannabis? 1%, 2.5%, 10%, 25%? Oh, the race is on. Kind of very even answers here. 10%, almost everyone's responded. 10%. Okay, so that's our highest, and then 2.5%. So it's actually 2.5%. I'm sure they're counting the entire population, so they would be including children and stuff as well. So and a variety of ages of people too. So it is about 2.5%. So according to the Canadian Tobacco, Alcohol, and Other Drugs Survey, in 2017, 15% of Canadians ages 15 or older reported using cannabis in the past year. And as you see from the bullets at the bottom there, the use has gone up over time. The Government of Canada is collecting a range of baseline data on cannabis use by Canadians to monitor and measure the impact of legalization and regulations of cannabis. This standardized and comparable data collection will also help inform policies and programs, including public education and awareness activities. So I did go and look up the Canadian Cannabis Survey that was done in 2019. So the cannabis use for 2018 was 22%, and for 2019 was 25%. Now this is the Canadian Cannabis Survey, where the survey we have these for is the Canadian Tobacco, Alcohol, and Other Drugs Survey. So again, sometimes people might not have always answered accurately when it was illegal, whereas now that it is legal, people might be more, when they're asked about cannabis, they might be more open and honest about it. And also because it's legal, now more people might be trying it as well. So we do see that that has increased a bit, and Canada will be continuing to collect that data. So this is cannabis use in Canada. Again, it's 2018, but the most common way it was used was smoking, and then eating it in food, and then vaporizing using a vape pen, and then vaporizing using vaping using a vaporizer. So smoking is kind of the most common, and they'll be tracking some of that over time. So health effects of cannabis. So what are some of the health effects of cannabis? So if you think some things that can happen to your health over time if people use cannabis. What are some things that can happen? So you can type some of those into the chat. What are some of the health effects of cannabis? That's a harder question. Lung issues, right, from chronic smoking, lung damage, yeah, especially if people are smoking it. Increased water intake, maybe. Mental health changes for sure. Less depressed. Psychiatric effects with long use with some people, right? So if you use it for longer term. Yeah. Sometimes it can cause depression in some people. Yeah, some people are saying less depressed. So yeah. So let's look at some of the health effects. Anxiety, good, awesome. Thanks, Roxanne. So reduced inflammation, for sure. People are using it for to help with some injuries, relieving pain, for sure. So when we're talking about health effects, often it's looking more at some of the negative effects, but there definitely can be some positive ones as well, as some of you are mentioning, minimize nerve pain, lowering inflammation, and things like that. So cannabis can give you slower reaction times. It can lower one's ability to pay attention and affects coordination and learning and decision making. It can reduce one's ability to perform well on the job or at school. It can cause anxiety or panic and can cause psychosis. It can also trigger a psychotic episode, so not knowing what is real, experiencing paranoia and having disorganized thoughts, and in some cases having hallucinations. It can impair one's ability to drive safely or operate equipment. So of course you shouldn't drive because it can increase your risks of getting in an accident. So one thing when we're talking about the health effects, we're looking at recreation cannabis and not medicinal marijuana, because sometimes people have been prescribed that. As we said, CAF members aren't, but we're looking more about the health effects of recreational use. So when we look at, yeah, and we'll talk, so Gabriel said there's a difference in long-term effects from the THC or the CBDs or the ratio, and we'll look at that as well in a bit. If you're choosing products, what you can choose. So the acute effects, there are significant impairments in physical and mental functioning, often accompanied by changes in appearance or behavior. So we can easily perceive those in individuals. So some of those things are the things you talked about, the glassy eyes, the poor coordination, the anxiety, being unusually talkative. Those are the acute effects, and we can see those in somebody, and those acute effects usually last from 2 to 6 hours, but they could last up to 12 hours if it's ingested. And then we have the residual effects. So the residual effects are more subtle, and they are impairments in physical and mental functioning, such as attention and judgment, and often they're not perceived by individuals or observers. So these residual effects may persist as long as 24 hours. This is based on healthy casual users consuming a moderate dose. Both acute or residual effects may be prolonged in frequent or heavy users and longer when consumed with alcohol or other drugs, which can delay the absorption and or the elimination. So there are some of those acute effects which don't last too long, but those residual effects can last longer. And if people are heavy users, they can last even longer. Just some other health effects. I'm not going to talk too much about this, but don't use cannabis and drive. Although the percent of Canadian drivers killed in vehicle crashes who tested positive for drugs now exceeds the number tested positive for alcohol. 39% reported driving within 2 hours of using cannabis. So we know the effects last longer than that. Again, if you're consuming cannabis, avoid driving. Next is cannabis poisoning. So accidentally consuming or consuming too much cannabis at a time can lead to temporary adverse effects, also called cannabis poisoning. So it could be accidental or it could be consuming too much. Cannabis poisoning is not generally known to be fatal. It can, however, have very unpleasant and potentially dangerous effects. Sometimes it might require emergency medical attention or in some cases hospitalization. children and pets are at greater risk of that accidental consumption. So symptoms can include chest pain, rapid heartbeat, nausea, vomiting, psychotic episodes, respiratory depression, severe anxiety, and or panic attacks. The higher the THC content in the product, the higher the likelihood of experiencing adverse effects or poisoning, especially if the person is a first-time or an inexperienced user. It's also easier to be poisoned if you're ingesting, so if you're eating or drinking cannabis compared to smoking or vaping it. This is because some of the products may be confused with non-cannabis products, so somebody may eat something or drink something they didn't know there was cannabis in. It can also take much longer to feel the effects, so the result is people will consume more when they feel the full effects. If anyone experiences symptoms of cannabis poisoning, they should seek immediate medical attention or call their local poison control center. And of course, if you use it more frequently, so longer term use, so using cannabis regularly, daily or almost daily, and over a long period, so several months or years, it can have some long-term effects. Okay, sorry about that. Thanks, Peter. So it can damage the lungs and make it harder to breathe. The cannabis smoke contains many of the same harmful substances as tobacco smoke. Like smoking cigarettes, smoking cannabis can damage one's lung. It can affect your mental health. Using cannabis regularly and continuously over time can cause anxiety and depression, psychotic and schizophrenia. High-strength cannabis products can worsen the mental health effects of cannabis use, and it can also make one physically dependent or addictive. Okay, and addiction as well. So cannabis can be addictive. Frequent cannabis use that starts in adolescence increases the chance of addiction. Close to 1 in 10 adults who have ever used cannabis will develop an addiction to it. This statistic rises to about 1 in 6 for people who start using cannabis as a teenager. Between 1 in 4 and 1 in 2 of cannabis daily smokers will develop an addiction. So how does cannabis affect young people's health? Cannabis use that begins early in adolescence, that is frequent, and that continues over time is more likely to bring about harms. Some of those harms may never fully go away, and youth are especially vulnerable to the effects of cannabis, as research shows the brain is not fully developed till about age 25. And of course, the higher the amount of THC in cannabis, the more likely Okay, there are also some health effects that are related to, according to sex. So the current state of evidence suggests that sex-dependent differences with respect to a number of cannabis outcomes. So they know, for example, studies suggest a greater prevalence of problematic use, so cannabis use disorder, among males. Other studies suggest females are more sensitive to the effects of THC, need less THC to achieve intoxication, are more likely to experience adverse effects related to acute cannabis consumption. And evidence also suggests that female cannabis consumers progress more quickly to dependence and addiction. More research is needed to understand why these fundamental sex differences happen related to cannabis. They don't know exactly why, but they found some of these things already. So kind of a bit of interesting thing how our bodies can react differently to cannabis. So pregnancy and breastfeeding, so just like tobacco and alcohol, a pregnant woman or a new mother's use of cannabis can affect her fetus or unborn child. The substances in cannabis are carried through the mother's blood to her fetus during pregnancy, and they can pass from the breast milk following birth, and this can lead to health problems for a child. So cannabis use during pregnancy can lead to a lower weight of the baby. And it's also associated with long-term development effects in children and adolescents. So children can have a decrease in memory function, their ability to pay attention, to reason, and to solve problems. So it can create some learning barriers for them. It can also create hyperactivity behavior and increase the risk for future substance use. So what can you do? Some of the things you can do to lower your risk, so some harm reduction. So research continues to evolve regarding the potential harms associated with cannabis use. The likelihood of developing a problematic relationship with cannabis, so cannabis use disorder, depends on 4 elements. So these are the 4 elements. So the length and intensity of consumption. So the longer, more intense consumption increases the risk. The potency of the product, so consuming higher levels of THC is more addictive. Individual factors as well, so genetic or individual vulnerabilities such as personality or experiences of trauma can impact whether a person experiences harms, and also the age of initiation. So people who begin to consume cannabis at a younger age, under 16, at a high frequency, are at greater risk. So what can you do to lower your risks? So this is just a pictogram that was created by Health Canada. So it's things you can do to lower your risk. So it looks at the 2 most common ways. So inhaling, so whether you're smoking or vaping or ingesting, eating or drinking. And of course, each way carries some health risks. So it always says start low and go slow. So start with a low level of THC and then don't have too much to start, just to see what the effects are, because it can be different for everybody. And as well, what can be some of the effects of new products? So everyone's response to cannabis is different. It can depend on your sex, your age, any pre-existing medical conditions, experience with cannabis, frequency of use, the THC and CBD content, the consumption of food, alcohol, other drugs, or other health products. And everyone's response to cannabis can differ from one time to the next. Again, regardless of the method of consumption, so whether you're smoking, vaping, eating, or drinking cannabis, avoid consuming with nicotine, alcohol, other drugs, or health products. This can increase the impairment and the risk of other adverse effects. So health products could be things like if you're taking some herbal medications or vitamins or minerals or traditional medicines or probiotics or things, other health products, you could always ask and see if you should be using cannabis in conjunction with that as well. So it's always good to be aware of that. So what are some of the things you can do to lower your risk? So start low, go slow, right? So lower levels of THC. So choose a product with a lower amount of THC and an equal or higher level of CBD. If consuming edibles, look for products that contain 2.5 milligrams of THC or less and wait to feel the effects before taking more. And remember, that can be 30 minutes, but it could be up to 3 or 4 hours. Avoid smoking cannabis. Avoid frequent use. Avoid consuming with nicotine, alcohol, other drugs, or health products. Store all cannabis products securely and out of reach of children or pets. You don't want cannabis poisoning. And of course, don't drive high. So I thought we'd look a little bit at COVID-19 and cannabis, since COVID-19 is kind of on all our minds and affecting our lives right now. So actually, this is about COVID-19 alcohol and cannabis use. So what you should know. So excessive or high-risk cannabis and alcohol use can weaken your immune system and make you more susceptible to COVID-19 and other illnesses. So it's talking about excessive or high-risk use. So if you have 1 drink, that's not going to affect it, but if you're using more, then it puts you at risk. So something to think about: what conditions around COVID-19 may lead people to increase alcohol or cannabis use? And you can type those into the chat. Why might people be, using more cannabis or drinking more alcohol right now. Loneliness, for sure. People are home alone or not having as much social interaction. Sometimes I feel bad for people that are living alone. You're stuck at home, right? So there's not a lot of other things to do. Plus, you don't need to drive anywhere. People could be depressed, for sure. It's quite a stressful time, can affect our mental health. Okay. They're curious. They'll say, hey, I'm home. Why not give it a try? For sure. Don't have anywhere to go. More time to enjoy your vacation. Sure, if you're at home more. Want some different activities to do. You're tired of doing the same thing over and over again. So, okay, good. All awesome answers. I think you guys mentioned most of these. So feeling stress and anxiety from the pandemic and the economic downturn. So using those, we know sometimes it increases our mood, improves our mood. Blurring of daily and weekly routines because of the closing of non-essential workplaces. So, it's 5 o'clock somewhere, right? And we don't, have to think about what day of the week it is and stuff because we are at home. Feelings of social isolation and loneliness due to physical distancing. So someone mentioned that being lonely, and more alcohol and cannabis in home from stockpiling. So people might have, well, I'm just going to go out once, or I'm just going to do this, so I'm going to stockpile. And of course, when it's there, you might drink more. I know there are some liquor stores and stuff that will deliver. So if you order more, I usually get free delivery or whatever. So people might stockpile it and then it's there. So there are some reasons during this time we may increase our intake of cannabis or alcohol. So just some things to know about cannabis, smoking, and vaping in relation to COVID-19. So I think most people know COVID-19 does affect the lungs and the lung tissue, and that's why they need ventilators and stuff for people who get really sick. So smokers, of course, have an increase in the adverse effects of COVID-19. So cannabis smoke contains many chemicals and fine particles that are known to be toxic and carcinogenic and to cause genetic mutations. So when smoking cannabis, using either a joint, a bong, or a pipe, individuals tend to inhale more deeply and to keep the smoke in their lungs for longer. These behaviors are intended to expose the respiratory system to greater quantities of the psychoactive ingredients in the cannabis, but it also results in greater exposure to toxins and chemicals that can irritate the respiratory tissue. So if that respiratory tissue is irritated, then you can be more affected by the COVID-19. Cannabis smoke can have a negative impact on lung health. Cannabis smoking is related to a greater incident of chronic cough and phlegm production. Other respiratory symptoms include wheezing, sore throat, chest tightness, and hoarse voice. And they have been extensively reported for regular heavier uses of cannabis. So long-term cannabis smoke can weaken the respiratory systems and lead to frequent episodes of chronic bronchitis. Okay, so weaken your lungs. Also, THC from cannabis smoke or in other forms can inhibit the ability of the immune system to protect the body from foreign pathogens, thus increasing the susceptibility to infections. So in humans, there's been a few studies that have shown that THC can inhibit the functioning of several types of immune cells in the lungs, an effect that has been suggested to alter the immune system defenses of lungs and increase susceptibility to infections. There have not been many studies examining the effects of THC and other cannabinoids on the immune system in humans, and they need to do more studies to confirm the effects of THC on immune competencies in both healthy and compromised individuals. So just remember, COVID-19 is relatively new. I know there was just an article recently that they think THC may be protective, and they also think nicotine might be protective, but they don't actually know that because it's been around, so things are always changing. Also, vaping of unregulated cannabis extracts can lead to severe lung and pulmonary illnesses. I think we all remember there was a few people that got very sick and a couple of deaths because of vaping. So cannabis vaping products that were mostly purchased on the illegal market have been associated with severe pulmonary issues, which in some cases actually resulted in death. It's unknown actually what substance or substances in these products led to these outcomes. The primary agent appears to be vitamin E, which is used as a thickening agent in cannabinoid-infused oils. So there are some dangers around that. Again, vaping is a generally newer thing, so they don't know all the health risks. So Canada has some lower risk cannabis use guidelines. So these were created by Canadian experts in mental health and addictions. So they are an evidence-based intervention project by the Canadian Research Institute of Substance Misuse and funded by the Canadian Institute of Health Research. So it's just not something that health promotion's made up for CAF members. It's something that's for all Canadians. Evidence indicates that a substantial extent of the risk of adverse health outcomes from cannabis use may be reduced by informed behavioral choices among users. So they feel if they can give out information that people can make good health choices. The vaping products sold legally are, oh wow, that's kind of cool to think that they're dangerous. Yeah, it's pretty scary. I know the Cannex stopped selling vaping products because of that. Although they still sell cigarettes, which we know have terrible health effects. But yeah, it's pretty scary. So there are 10 lower risk cannabis user guidelines. So these are the first two. So cannabis use has some health risks, best avoided by abstaining. So if you want to avoid the health risks, because there are some, do not use cannabis. If you decide to use, you can experience immediate as well as long-term risks to your health and well-being. Anytime you choose not to use, you avoid those risks. So it's good to be aware that there are some risks if you're choosing to use. I've talked about this a few times, but delay taking up cannabis use until later in life. Using cannabis at a younger age, particularly before age 16, increases the likelihood of developing health, educational, and social problems. Avoid cannabis use during adolescence. Generally, the later in life one begins to use cannabis, the lower the chance of the problems. The next two, identify and choose lower risk cannabis products. So high potency cannabis products with high THC content are more likely to result in harm. Some products contain a higher dose of CBD, which counteracts some of the THC's adverse effects. This means that products with a high CBD to THC ratio reduce some of the risks. Individuals should know what they're using and ideally choose cannabis products with lower risks of harm. Don't use synthetic cannabinoids, talked about that before, so K2 and spice. Again, severe health problems, even death. So if you're going to use natural cannabis products. Avoid smoking burnt cannabis and choose safer ways to use. Smoking burnt cannabis, especially combined with tobacco, can harm one's lungs and respiratory system. Users can choose other methods such as vaporizers or edibles instead, but recognize they also come with a risk. For example, edibles are safer for your lungs, but users may consume larger doses and experience more severe impairment because psychoactive effects are delayed. So any type of use does have some risks, and it's good to be aware of those. If you smoke cannabis, avoid harmful smoking practices. So users who smoke cannabis should avoid deep inhalation or breath holding. These practices are meant to increase the psychoactive experience, but they also increase the amount of toxic materials absorbed by the lungs and into the body. Limit and reduce how often you use cannabis. So frequent use, daily or almost daily, is strongly linked to a higher risk of health and social problems. One should limit their own and ideally their friends and others they are using with to occasional use, so such as weekends or one day a week at most, which can be hard when we're not sure what the weekends are right now. Don't use and drive or operate other machinery. So driving while impaired by cannabis increase the risk of being involved in an accident, so injury or death, and also don't operate machinery during that time. They say you should wait at least 6 hours after having cannabis to drive, or even longer. I think the CAF in their DAOD suggested at least 8 hours. So combining cannabis and alcohol further increases that impairment. So users should be sure to avoid this combination if they plan to drive. And the last two, avoid cannabis use altogether if you're at risk for mental health problems or are pregnant. Some individuals should not use cannabis because of specific risk profile. So if someone in your immediate family has a history of psychosis or substance use disorder, their risk of cannabis-related mental health problems increases and they should abstain from use. Of course, pregnant women should not use because it can harm their fetus or their newborn. And also avoid combining these risks. So give me kind of some risky things that increase the harms. So the more the risky behaviors one engages in when using cannabis, the higher the risk of harms. So for example, initiating cannabis use at a young age and smoking high potency products every day puts one at higher risk of immediate or long-term problems. So combining the high risk choices can affect that. That's kind of the end. I have like one other little slide and a couple polls for you. I'm just going to have a look through the chat and see if I missed any questions. I know Michael asked something up here. Knee injuries and pain at night. And as Michael said, I think he was curious. Check her medical file and suggest she was a good candidate. Called, virtually approved to give her prescription. I think, Michael, I think your kind of question maybe has been answered and stuff. I think, oh, the CAF says 24 hours before driving. So they're looking at the residual effects of that. Okay, awesome. Thanks, Gabriel. I think, Michael, yeah, I think it's good to ask a medical doctor those questions, especially if it's prescribed, so it's medicinal. I'm sure that the cannabis industry will be doing some research to see what some of the health effects and the benefits are over the next few years. So I'm gonna have a couple of handouts I'm gonna share with you as well. Do that right now. They are there, and so you can download them if you'd like. So there are 3 of them. They are on the inhaling versus ingesting. It's a pictogram, and there's also 2 handouts on COVID-19 and cannabis use. So they are there for you. These are some resources that are available. So Canadian Forces Member Assistance Program, Suicide Hotline, information on COVID, Family Information Line, Sexual Misconduct Response Center, Kids Health Phone, the ARC line in support of COVID-19. So just if you feel you need to reach out, you can do that. Oh, someone has to sign off. Oh, if prescribed by a civilian doctor, but the military does not recognize it, what will happen to the member? Release, Andrew's asking that. I think that's a really good question. I think you need to ask the medical staff that, but I'm pretty sure that they will start to work on whether they put you on TCAT or PCAT, how that would work. So yeah, I think Andrew's pretty thumb up. So yeah, I think that they would start to review your file if it's prescribed. And I guess they would look at your medical condition as well if you could continue. So before people go, I just have a couple, 2 last little polls that are really quick. Again, we're collecting some data on this. I'm not going to share these. So can you apply your learning to today? And also, Not doing that right. Sorry about that. And how are you satisfied with the Demio platform? I'm not going to share those answers with everybody, but just reflecting some data on how people feel about it. Thank you so much today. I did pretty good about staying. Topicals and the use in the forces. Okay, so Gabriel is looking at that. So I'm not sure. That would be something you would need to ask somebody at your clinic about. Oh, Amy wants to mic in. And Gabriel, because the topicals we're talking about are the ones that are, Amy, I don't think I can give you your microphone because you're on your phone. Is that correct, or a tablet? I know some people I can allow, but because, correct, you're on your phone. So I can't let you use your microphone for whatever reason. It doesn't let me do that. So that's okay. Do you want to type in your question or your information, or is it too long? I think the topical stuff, going back to Gabriel's, is that that the health services will have to look at if they will subscribe or give military members those topicals to help if they think it will. I'm sure they're not doing it right now, but once there is some more, some research around it, they'll do it. Oh, Amy said that's okay. Sorry about that. That is one kind of drawback of Demio, is that if you're doing from your phone and your tablet, the participation isn't quite the same, which is unfortunate. I know Zoom does let you do that. I will stay on for a little bit more if anybody has any other questions. I'll stop sharing. The handouts are there to download if you want to have them. There is some information there for you. Topicals. Will says, thanks, Will. Enjoy I want to say happy weekend, although it's only Thursday. It's getting close to the weekend. Okay, most people have answered the polls. Awesome, thank you for doing that. I know if it's your first time on Demio, it's kind of hard to answer whether it's good or not. I know lots of people have been doing Zoom. Andrew said, thanks, Vanessa. Thanks, Roxanne. It's good to have people from all over. Gabriel said, do I have any opinion? No, I don't really have an opinion on cannabis. I did read an article once how ultra runners were often using edibles to deal with that. And I know that lots of people who are kind of endurance athletes might use it, especially the CBD. Ben says, thank you. So I think there'll be more research done on the CBD, but again, that's a good thing to ask a medical professional, because that's not what I am. So, but that's a good thing to ask your doctor or nurse about those things in the CBD, because there has been some studies saying it can help with muscle recovery and stuff as well. So I don't know if that answers your question, but you need to ask a medical professional about it. So, and they may have different opinions until the research is done and there's enough research to support that. They may not advocate for it. I know some people have used CBD for their pets as well, if they've had some pets with some joint issues and stuff. So Gabrielle, I think it's awesome. I think it is an awesome use. So Amy is saying, watch some Joe Rogan podcasts, and he is a huge endorser. So I'm sure there will be some more research going on, especially those companies may do some to support it. So yeah. Okay, awesome. Some good discussion. I think Gabrielle too, ask some more people if you know some people that are using it. Just remember, it is under the same regulations as anything that has THC in it as well. So let's be good. Oh, Amy's going to PM them. Awesome. Good. Thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to sign off and say goodbye. I think most people are kind of have gone away anyway, I think. So that's good. Enjoy the rest of your day.